Well, hello from Canberra, where the sun is just rising on what promises to be a hot summer's day. My name is Robert Cribb. I'm one of the team of Viking Resident Historians. I normally speak on the Viking cruises in Australia, New Zealand and Southeast Asia. Cruising hasn't resumed in Australia yet, but the prospects are pretty promising for fairly early in the coming year. Now, my ancestors came to Australia in the middle of the 19th century. They came from the United Kingdom, and they came for the usual range of reasons. Some were fleeing poverty, some were seeking political freedom, some were lured by gold, and inevitably there was one who came unwillingly as a guest of His Majesty. He was discovered in possession of 5 sheep that weren't actually his, and ended up having to come to Australia. I love talking about Australian history, and today I'm going to present to you the Viking iconic lecture on the history of Australia from the very earliest times up until the middle of the 19th century, which is the start of the gold rushes. I'll begin by saying a little bit about the Australian environment, a little bit about the natural environment, and then the long period in which Australia was dominated by the people whom today we call Aboriginal Australians. I'll talk about the difficult early contact between those first inhabitants of Australia and the European settlers who arrived in the late 18th century. And then I'll talk about the about the creation of a colonial society in Australia. But first, let's just have a quick look at Australia. You can see from this map that Australia is almost exactly the same size as the contiguous states of the United States. But Australia has a population of 25 million people. The reason why our population is so small is that most of the land that you see on this map is dry. It's either desert or very parched land. Those vast lakes that you can see hardly ever contain water. For most of the time, they are flat, white salt pans, and only once in 10 or 20 years do they actually have water in them. In the bottom left-hand corner, you can see Australia's national flag. The Union Jack reflects our heritage as a former British colony, and the Southern Cross is a feature of the night skies in Australia. Of course, we share the Southern Cross with every other country in the Southern Hemisphere, but for Australians, the Southern Cross seems to belong to us. We have it on our national flag, and it's an important national symbol. If you travel on one of the Viking cruises to Australia, then you will certainly at some stage see the Southern Cross hovering over the southern horizon, pointing towards the South Pole. The flag in the middle is the Aboriginal flag. The black at the top symbolises the sky, the yellow circle is the sun, and the red is the red of the soil of the centre. The third flag is the flag of Australia's other Indigenous group, the Torres Strait Islanders. This is an Indigenous group that lives in the Torres Strait, which lies between Australia and New Guinea, much smaller in numbers than Australian Aborigines, but a distinctive ethnic group. They have their own flag. The symbol on that flag is a ceremonial headdress which surrounds the Star of Peace. We're going to talk today about the arrival of Aboriginal Australians in Australia. We'll talk about the contact of those Australians, first with the Dutch and later with the British. We'll talk about the founding of a penal colony in Australia in the late 18th century, about the arrival of missionaries, and we will end at just before gold is discovered in Australia. The discovery of gold transforms everything for the Australian settlement. We won't have time today to talk about the creation of the Australian Federation out of 6 separate colonies and the founding of my city, Canberra. and we won't have time to talk about modern Australian culture, particularly in Sydney and Melbourne. That's the material for this second iconic lecture on Australian history. So you saw from the map that Australia is an island. Australia's been isolated from the rest of the world by sea for the last 40 million years. And during this period, a unique flora and fauna has evolved in Australia. Australia is dominated by eucalypts, by gum trees. And if you arrive in Australia after there's been rain, you can smell the scent of the eucalypts on the breeze, on the wind. Australia's native animals are dominated by marsupials, pouched mammals, including the kangaroo and the wombat, and we have a vast population of raucous birds. Most visitors to Australia are struck by the huge population of large and often quite aggressive birds that we have. When you arrive in Australia, you'll notice that we have a very strict biosecurity regime. This is because Australia's isolation has meant that we're spared from many of the plant and animal diseases that afflict agriculture and farming in other parts of the world. So there's a very strict set of rules when you disembark from the Viking ships in Australia. No fruit, no meat, no dairy, and that's to protect the unique environment of Australia. So human beings arrived in Australia around 50,000 years ago. Recently, there's been a little bit of evidence that points in the direction of an earlier arrival, but it's controversial evidence and it's simply one piece of evidence. So most people think that humans arrived around 50,000 years ago as part of the vast migration of humans out of Africa, which began 60 to 70,000 years ago. Once humans arrived in Australia, they spread very rapidly across the continent. And as far as we can tell, there was only one arrival. Today's Aboriginal Australians are descendants of people who travelled all that way from Africa 50,000 years ago and who must have crossed the sea to reach Australia. There's never been a land bridge between Australia and Asia. So we know that these early settlers in Australia must have been seafarers. Now, we don't know very much about them, and indeed amongst Australian Aborigines, Aboriginal Australians, I should say, there is no folk memory of arrival in Australia. So from their point of view, they have been here forever. The earliest human traces, the earliest human remains that have been found in Australia come from a place called Lake Mungo in New South Wales. You can see a picture of Lake Mungo on the screen. Today it's an arid, almost desert location. But 40,000 years ago, it was a lush environment with water holes, forests, and a great deal of food for people to eat. And what archaeologists found there were human burials. They found bodies that had been laid in graves and sprinkled carefully with red ochre. It's one of the oldest signs of human culture that we've found anywhere in the world, a sign that these were people with religious beliefs about the supernatural, about the hereafter, which led them to treat their dead with respect and with special rituals. The remains were held for many years in a museum, but they've now been returned to the traditional custodians of that land, the local Aboriginal community. And part of the environment that those early Aboriginal Australians lived in was a population of very large marsupials that is today extinct. On the screen you can see an animal called Diprotodon, which is a wombat the size of a cow. These megafauna, these very large animals, became extinct not long after Aboriginal Australians arrived in the country, and it seems quite likely that it was hunting that made them extinct. Nonetheless, after that initial wave of adjustment, that initial wave of extinction, Australian Aborigines developed a very close relationship with their environment, living as part of the landscape rather than destroying it. Those very early times in Australian history are often referred to as the Dreamtime. The term's sometimes misunderstood as meaning people were wandering around in a bit of a haze, but it's simply a translation of a term that we use in English, time immemorial. It's the time before records, it's a time before direct memories. For Aboriginal people, it's a time when humans walked the landscape along with spirits and developed a repertoire of stories about that landscape, which tied them closely to the land. We're now fairly certain, however, that around about 5,000 years ago, Australia and the Aboriginal Australians underwent some important cultural changes. Now, 5,000 years ago is when the first civilizations began to emerge in Asia, and it's very likely that there's a connection between those two events. The civilizations in India and China gave rise to much more commerce and trade through Southeast Asia, and it's very likely that Australia was also touched by that intensification of human contact. One of the first signs, or one of the clearest signs of that contact, was the arrival in Australia of dingoes, wild dogs, which came as companion animals. And for the next 5,000 years, although some dingoes lived as wild dogs in the countryside, in the bush, others lived together with the Aboriginal Australians as companion animals and as hunting companions. So there was a very close relationship between dingoes and Aboriginal Australians. And it was around this time that the Aboriginal Australians began to use fire as a means of hunting. So they would burn part of the bush in order to drive their prey into places where they could be speared. Now, this increase in the use of fire for hunting transformed the landscape in Australia. And it's that use of fire that's particularly responsible for the prevalence of eucalypts in Australia. Eucalypts are made to be burnt. They've got a lot of oil in the leaves. They've got beautiful burning timber. Many species have dry bark that hangs in ribbons from the trunk. If fire gets in amongst a group of eucalypts, it takes off and it can burn with great intensity. And of course, we've seen in Australia in recent years some extremely intense bushfires. So eucalypts are made to be burnt, but they're also very quick to recover after bushfires. So as a result of repeated firing of the Australian bush, eucalypts became the dominant tree across Australia. About this time as well, we find evidence of more extensive use of technology. In some parts of Australia, the local Aboriginal communities constructed eel traps. They came close to something like aquaculture, creating an environment in which fish or eels or other aquatic prey would thrive better than they would in the natural environment. They began to trade. They traded red ochre, which was used in ceremonial dances. They traded the plant that you can see on the right-hand side of your screen called pituri. It's a slightly narcotic plant. It contains nicotine, and the leaves of pituri were traded all across Australia from around 5,000 years ago. And also as part of this process, there was a process of homogenization of, of Aboriginal languages. Most of the languages that are spoken amongst the Aboriginal communities belong to a family called Pama-Nyungan. They're not entirely mutually intelligible, but it's a bit like the Romance languages, a bit like Spanish, French, Italian. They're very, very similar. So if you hear someone speaking in the local Aboriginal language from the north coast of Queensland, and you hear someone speaking their local language from Victoria, you'll very often hear similarities in vocabulary, similarities in structure between those languages. And this contact across the whole of the continent, the whole of this vast continent, was made possible because people moved, people travelled. And as they travelled, they learnt where to go, they learnt how to find their way across the continent by singing songs that told the stories of the landscape that they were passing through. These days we call these stories songlines, the lines across the landscape illustrated by songs that identify geographical landscapes and tell through the singer the story of early events, sometimes historical events, sometimes natural events, sometimes mythological events that happened in relation to that landscape. There are places in Australia that are famous for short-term abundance of local resources. Here in Canberra, there were moths called bogong moths, which used to arrive in their billions. And although you mightn't think that a moth is a very attractive thing to eat, these are large moths with very large bodies. And I've eaten them once. They taste a little bit like a nut snack. Aboriginal people used to come from great distances to feast on the bogong moths during the season. In Queensland, there are bunya pines. It's a rare species of pine tree that occurs only in one part of Queensland. They produce every 3 years a large cone which is full of edible nuts that taste something between a potato and a pine nut. Aboriginal people came from very long distances to feast together every 3 years and to exchange stories and to talk to each other. Amongst the stories they exchanged were the stories of the rainbow serpent. The rainbow serpent is a creature of the sky. It arches across from horizon to horizon, and it's associated with rain and with water, which of course in a very dry continent is crucial to survival. It's quite likely that the stories of the rainbow serpent also arrived in Australia around 5,000 years ago and had some connection with the widespread cults of the naga or snake in Southeast Asia. There are other stories of strange animals in Australia. Even when I was growing up, we were told stories of a creature called the bunyip, which lived in waterholes and which would be ready to emerge from those waterholes and seize any child that made the mistake of coming too close. So it was part of the boogeyman stories of my youth and the youth of most people of my generation. But Australia didn't stay relatively isolated. In the 16th century, globalization became increasingly important. First, the Spanish and the Portuguese came to into the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean, and in the 17th century, the Dutch established the Dutch East India Company, which became increasingly the dominant power in what is today Indonesia. Initially, when the Dutch vessels sailed around the Cape of Good Hope at the southern end of Africa, they sailed straight across the Indian Ocean to Java. But after a couple of decades, a Dutch captain called Hendrik Brouwer discovered that if he let his vessel sail directly across the Indian Ocean in the 40s latitudes, it was much faster. The winds, the 40s are known as the roaring 40s because the constant strong winds that circulate the Earth at that latitude. So if he could catch the roaring 40s, it was taken very fast across the Indian Ocean, and then he simply had to make sure that the captain had to make sure that he turned northwards at the right moment in order to reach Java. If a captain failed to turn left, I should say, at the right moment, then the risk was that the ship ran up against Australia. And there's a whole series of shipwrecks along that western coast of Australia. And we know that in some cases Dutch sailors made it ashore, and we can find even a few traces of Dutch cultural and genetic influence in the local Aboriginal communities along that coast. Shortly afterwards, it was not just Europeans who began to come into contact with Australia, but also people from Indonesia. During the 17th and 18th century, there was enormous demand in China for sea cucumbers. They're also called bêche de mer or trepang, and you can see a picture of one of them on the bottom right-hand corner of your screen. They're collected from the sandy floor of shallow reef waters, gutted, dried and smoked, and then shipped back to China, where they are they were and remain a great delicacy. I have myself collected one of these. I picked it up from the sandy floor of a reef atoll. I carefully gutted it, I smoked it, I dried it, and when I got home I turned it into a soup, and I can tell you it is very definitely an acquired taste. I've only done it once. I only intend to do it once, but it was a delicacy at that time. And when the supply of sea cucumber from the Indonesian waters began to dry up, began to become scarcer, Indonesians began to cross the Timor Sea to the north coast of Australia. And in the 18th century, we have a significant number of records of Indonesians who spent months on the coast of Australia collecting the sea cucumber, smoking them, drying them, smoking them, and working with local Aboriginal people. In the 1970s, there was an Australian researcher who visited Makassar on the Indonesian island of Sulawesi and met Indonesians who were descended from Aboriginal Australians who had returned to Indonesia with those fishermen in the 18th century. Now, the presence of Indonesians didn't lead to long-term settlement. The settlement of Australia by outsiders was a consequence of the activities of this man, Captain James Cook. He's very often regarded as the discoverer of Australia. Of course, he wasn't the discoverer of Australia. Aboriginal Australians were here for 50,000 years before he arrived. The Dutch had seen Australia, possibly the Portuguese as well. Indonesians had seen Australia. But it was Cook's expeditions that led to the settlement that led in turn to the creation of Australian society. So in 1767, Cook was sent by the Admiralty to the South Pacific, to the island of Tahiti, to observe the transit of Venus. This was to observe Venus, the planet, moving across the sun. It was a really big deal because in those days it was going to be a means of calculating more accurately the distance between the Earth and the sun. So it was a major scientific expedition sent to a distant part of the world. However, Cook also had some secret instructions. after he had finished looking at the transit of Venus, he was to sail to the west and to see whether he could discover what was imagined might be a great south land. You can see on this map a rather indistinct shape to the south of Africa, to the south of Asia. It was widely believed at the time that there must be a very large landmass somewhere in the southern hemisphere to balance all the land that was in the northern hemisphere. So Cook's instructions were to see what he could find in what was still a completely unknown part of the globe from the point of view of Europeans. And he was instructed to take possession of places that might be useful for Britain's imperial expansion in Asia. Even in this new expedition, after the astronomical investigations that took place in Tahiti, there was a very strong scientific element in Cook's expedition. Aboard Cook's ship, the Endeavour, was Sir Joseph Banks, who was one of the leading British natural historians of the time. He was a towering figure. He was the David Attenborough of his day, you might even say. He led the scientific dimension of the trip, of the expedition, and when they arrived in Australia, he could barely contain his excitement. Here was a whole new continent full of new and exciting plants. The first place that the expedition landed in Australia was given the name Botany Bay because the botanists who were aboard Cook's vessel were so excited by what they discovered. Banks gave his name in due course to one of Australia's iconic flowers, the Banksia. It's a form of protea that produces spectacular candle-like flowers that you can see on your screen. Now, Banks and the other botanists hoped that what they would find in Australia was not only exciting new plants, but useful plants. When Europe came in contact with the Americas, they encountered not just gold and silver, but also tomato, maize, tobacco, chili, many other useful crops that transformed the diet and transformed the quality of cooking in Europe. And there was hope that they would find the same kind of exciting range of new crops in Australia. As it turned out, the only native Australian plant that has been significantly commercialised is the macadamia nut. And that's mainly been commercialised in Hawaii rather than in Australia. So from the point of view of a commercial discovery of new plants, Australia was a bit disappointing, but from the point of view of botanical discovery, it was exciting. Cook sailed up the eastern coast of Australia, and in August 1770, he claimed the whole of the eastern part of the continent in the name of King George. He didn't claim the western part of the continent because at this time, Britain was in alliance with Portugal, and Portugal, since 1529, had a deal with the Spanish to divide the world between them. They drew a line which roughly ran from Japan all the way south to the South Pole. Portugal had what was to the west of that line. Spain had what was to the east of the line. Britain didn't mind taking territory from Spain, but they drew the line at taking territory from Portugal. So the border that today runs between Western Australia and the rest of the country is a very ancient border. It goes back to 1529. It's sometimes said that Cook assumed that Australia was empty, that when he took possession of Australia the eastern part of Australia, he intended to dispossess the Aboriginal Australians of their land. And it's a slight misunderstanding of what he imagined he was doing. In those days, the British view, the European view, was that to be a civilized country, you had to have a king, you had to have a sovereign. If you didn't have a sovereign, then you were in a state of savagery. And the first step towards bringing a community into greater civilization was to give them a king. So what he was doing in 1770 was, of course, claiming the rights of the British Empire over Eastern Australia, installing King George as the king of that region, but he wasn't at this time taking the land from Aboriginal Australians. That was a process that happened, but it happened later on, and we'll come to that shortly. Now, it's about this point where Australian history intersects with the history of the United States. The American Revolution took place just a few years after Cook had sailed up the east coast of Australia. One of the consequences of the success of the American Revolution was that Britain was no longer able to send convicted prisoners to the American colonies, specifically to Georgia. And as a result, there was a growing accumulation of people who had been sentenced to prison in the British prisons. Soon there were too many for the prisons, and the British authorities resorted to storing them in really terrible conditions in ships that were no longer suitable for going to sea, that were beached along the shore, the lower shores of the Thames estuary close to London, in really appalling conditions. So there was a bit of a humanitarian issue with the conditions in prisons and aboard the convict hulks. What was going to be done with them? But Britain also had a growing imperial interest in this part of the world, in the Pacific. They'd lost their American colonies, but they hadn't given up on being a great power. And the British authorities were increasingly looking for somewhere that might be a secure base far away from Europe, so in the Pacific region, somewhere with plenty of open space that they could establish a viable settlement, somewhere which would be a base for their commercial operations on the coast of China. Now, it seems a bit strange to think of Australia as a commercial base for China, but it was still very much closer to China than anywhere in Europe. Of course, Australia was later overtaken by Singapore and by Hong Kong. But the idea began to develop in British official circles to kill two birds with one stone, to solve the humanitarian problem in the hulks and the prisons, and to create a new settlement on the other side of the world in Botany Bay. So in 1788, a fleet, which we now call the First Fleet, arrived in Botany Bay with the intention of setting up a new British settlement on the other side of the world. Now, Botany Bay was never intended to be a prison. It was never intended to be a penal colony. Instead, it was a convict settlement. The people who were sent there were convicts, they were prisoners, they were subject to the harsh discipline that came with being prisoners. But they were sent there as settlers, not to be punished. And because of that intention, the British government also made certain very soon to send women convicts as well, with the intention that they would pair up with the male convicts and create a self-sustaining local community. Now, the settlement began in Botany Bay, but Botany Bay turned out not to be a very suitable place for settlement. And very quickly they moved just a few miles north to Sydney. And if you have the chance to sail into Sydney Harbour aboard one of the Viking vessels, or indeed to sail out of Sydney Harbour, you'll see what a magnificent harbour Sydney has. It's one of the great harbours of the world. And they chose one of the little bays in this harbour called Sydney Cove to create the core of their settlement. And very quickly it turned into a small but relatively self-sustaining community. And the convicts who were sent there very soon enjoyed much more freedom than they would have in Australia. It's not widely known that the idea of parole was invented in Australia. The idea that a convict could be released with his or her own promise to continue to behave well. And this was done in Australia with the idea of creating a relatively free labour force that would help to make this new settlement viable. Viable, of course, is a somewhat relative term. The early years of Sydney were very difficult. Sydney was a rough, tough port town, a long way from the centres of power. The authorities in Sydney needed to be able to punish the community that they tried to govern, and so in isolated places in the general region, but some distance from Sydney, they set up a whole series of real penal colonies, real prisons. In Van Diemen's Land, which became Tasmania, in Moreton Bay, which became Brisbane, on Norfolk Island out in the Pacific, they set up prisons which became a byword for brutality. In fact, Botany Bay and then Sydney were themselves not especially brutal, but in Britain, the term Botany Bay, the name Botany Bay, lived on as the term for the Australian settlement, and Australian folklore is full of mournful songs about convicts who end up being sent to Botany Bay, far from their friends and relations, far from their loved ones. The combination of distance and the reputation of Botany Bay for being a terribly difficult place to live meant that there were some people who would do anything not to be sent there. Because the intention of Botany Bay was to create a settlement, every now and then the British authorities would offer condemned men who'd been condemned to be hanged, to be executed, would offer them passage to Australia as an alternative to death. And on quite a number of occasions, they chose death rather than coming to Australia. Of course, we all think that wasn't a very good decision. It wasn't just the inhabitants of the colony that were a bit on the rough side. The local garrison was up to its eyeballs in corruption, in smuggling of rum. They were known as the Rum Rebellion. Things got so bad that the British authorities ended up sending William Bligh, who as governor of the colony. Now Bligh, as most of you will know, had been the captain of the Bounty. He was famous as a disciplinarian. He was famous as a great navigator. He was put into a tiny boat by the mutineer Fletcher Christian and managed to sail safely all the way across the Pacific Ocean to Timor and finally made it home. So if anyone could sort out the Australian colony, it seemed that it was Bligh, but it turned out that things were too much for him. The Rum Regiment, the local garrison, staged a coup against him, put him in prison, and eventually sent him home. At which point the British authorities said, okay, enough is enough, and they sent a new armed force to try and bring the colony under control. And relatively speaking, that worked. So the colony began to spread into the bush. It began to spread beyond Sydney Cove, out over the Great Dividing Range, which runs the whole length of Australia from north to south, out into the vast plains of the interior. And that expansion came overwhelmingly at the expense of the Aboriginal inhabitants of the country. Although Cook and the British authorities in general recognised them as the inhabitants of the continent, because they moved around the landscape, because they didn't, for the most part, have any kind of cultivation. They didn't stay in one spot and grow crops and harvest them and store them for the next season. They were regarded as not being connected with the land, and they were then forced off the land. They were encouraged, forced to settle down and to become farmers themselves. But when that happened, of course, they tended to be given the less fertile, the less favourable areas of land. They suffered terribly from disease. New diseases like smallpox and influenza enormously reduced their numbers, and in a relatively small population, this loss of human capital was catastrophic. It meant that knowledge, cultural knowledge, practical knowledge of living in the landscape was often lost. And these days we are starting to understand just how many massacres of Aboriginal people there were in this era. When I was growing up, the stories we heard were more or less that Aboriginal Australians had simply disappeared. But now we know that there were many hundreds of incidents in which small communities, sometimes large communities, were killed by the settlers. The earliest massacres were in the south of Australia as European settlement pushed to the north. The Aboriginal communities there began to organise, and in the late 19th century there was real warfare in the north. Aboriginal communities learnt how to use firearms, and they became organised to resist the expansion of the settlers. But of course, to no avail. They were up against a much better armed and much larger enemy, and so everywhere in Australia the Aboriginal communities were made subordinate to the settlers. Missionaries also worked amongst Aboriginal communities. They were amongst the first group to work really hard to protect Aboriginal communities from the depredations of the European settlers. But of course, as part of that protection, they often insisted that not just that the Aboriginal Australians convert to Christianity, but that they abandon many of their traditional customs, their traditional beliefs, and become more like the settlers who were displacing them. So early Australia was a rough environment. It was not wealthy. It was discovered that the Australian environment was ideal for merino sheep, for the sheep that produce the best wool. And it wasn't just the landscape of Australia that was suited to wool. Wool was a very valuable commodity, and it was easy to ship over large quantities. You could take the wool from the sheep, put it into bales. It didn't really matter how long it took to get those bales to the port. It didn't matter how long it took the ship to carry the wool from the port back to Europe. It was still in good condition. And it was with the discovery of the potential for raising sheep and creating wool in Australia that the economy of this small settlement began to transform. This man, John MacArthur, who was one of Bligh's great enemies in the so-called Rum Rebellion, was also the pioneer of the sheep and the wool industry. For a long time, he was on our $2 note, and it was his efforts, imitated by others, that began to turn Australia from being an isolated, rough settlement to somewhere where a certain amount of money was sloshing around. Of course, out in on the frontier, out far from Sydney, conditions were still very difficult for the settlers. But Sydney, by the middle of the 19th century, had turned into a small city. It was a place of culture, a place of dances, a place of museums, a place of churches, a place of political debate. And here too, Australian history intersected with that of the United States. In the late 18th century, Britain had resisted any kind of transfer of power to the American colonies. Britain itself was a deeply authoritarian and corrupt society. But by the middle of the 19th century, Britain had learnt the lesson of the American Revolution, that it was dangerous to alienate settlers when they were a long way across the sea and you weren't going to be able to discipline them. And Britain itself had become a more open and democratic society. So in this era, talk began to circulate in the colony of a new future for the colony, for the settlement, an idea that this might turn into a kind of Britain, but way across the seas. And then in 1851, gold was discovered. And gold meant money. Gold meant a vast influx of population, and gold transformed everything for Australia. But those transformations are the topic of the second Viking iconic lecture on the history of Australia, and it's possible you'll have to join one of our cruises to hear that lecture. So thank you all for listening to me today. The sun has now hit the top of the trees just outside my window, and it does indeed look like a very warm day. The sky is blue, and they're predicting a really hot day. So I will now turn over to our moderator, Scott Bennett, who will field the questions for me. Thank you very much.
Perfect. Thank you very much. Fantastic presentation. So we've got quite a few questions here. One from Thomas, who is in the United States. He says, you mentioned the balance of land masses in your presentation. What does this mean?
Okay, so in the 17th century, before Europeans had sailed very far south of South America, south of Africa, there was a theory that because the globe was round, there should be more land somewhere in the southern hemisphere. In the northern hemisphere, there was North America, there was part of South America, there was part of Africa, there was Europe, there was Asia. That's a lot of land. And there was a feeling that there should be some more land somewhere in the south. And the only big empty space was in what we call today the South Pacific Ocean. So there was, on many maps of that time, the cartographers speculated that there must be a large continent here, and they often marked it as Terra Australis Incognita, the unknown Great South Land. So that was the idea of a balance.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Robert. Moving on to Steve. He's from the United Kingdom. And his question is, was the arrival of the first Aboriginal people responsible for the end of Australia's megafauna?
So that's a very important question, and it's quite a controversial issue. The arrival of the first Australians and the extinction of the megafauna more or less coincide. In fact, the Aboriginal Australians arrived first, and then within a few thousand years, the megafauna largely disappeared. So since they'd been there for many millions of years, and since we know that the arrival of humans everywhere else in the world also led to the extinction of megafauna, it seems very likely. But there are also climatic changes which may well have contributed and may have been an important element in the extinction of those of that megafauna.
Perfect, thank you, Robert. And then a question from Roger, who is in the UK. He asks, what is known about the type of boats that the Aborigines may have used to make their way from the mainland to Australia?
Easy to answer that. The answer is we know nothing at all. We assume that they were not large boats, that they were probably canoes or rafts, but they would have been made of wood, and of course they haven't survived. And as I said, there's no remnant of an arrival story amongst Aboriginal Australians. So they don't have a story amongst their many, many legends of having come to the land. That's in contrast with New Zealand, for instance, where the Maori have a very strong story of their arrival on the New Zealand islands. So we really don't know what kind of ships or what kind of boats it might have been.
Perfect, thank you, Robert. And then I've got Derek here from the UK, and he says he's interested in Aboriginal art and the rock paintings. Can you recommend the best sites in Australia to see such works?
Oh, that's a very good question. So many of them are quite isolated. My favourite place is Carnarvon Gorge in Queensland. It's out in the middle of a flat, almost desert plain. It's a sandstone gorge, and on the walls of some of the overhangs in the gorge, there are some really striking Aboriginal paintings, hand stencils of boomerangs, pictures of Aboriginal pictures of Australian wildlife. Most of the really good locations are relatively isolated, so it takes a bit of effort to get to them. There's one small location near where I live here in Canberra. So I could get there in a couple of hours, and there's only a walk of about an hour and a half from the car park to reach it. But that's a small site. There's just a few paintings there, so it's possible to see paintings. But to see the really good ones, you've got to go a bit further afield. And I would recommend Carnarvon Gorge. It's a fantastic place.
Good, fantastic. And then a question here from Johnson, who is in the United States. He says, can you recommend any good books, historical and fiction, which can help bring Australian history to life?
Okay, there's a lot that's been written. I think there's two authors I'd particularly recommend. One is Robert Hughes' The Fatal Shore. Now, it's a story about convict settlement in Australia. It's, I think, a bit over-dramatised. He calls it the fatal shore. He stresses the hardships that the convicts faced. But it's a beautifully written book, and it's really evocative. I would also very much recommend the writings of a historian called John Hirst. He wrote a short history of Australia. He wrote a number of longer works on Australian history, and he gives a very clear, down-to-earth view of the way that Australia came into being. So those two authors, Robert Hughes and John Hirst, Hirst, are the two that I would recommend most strongly.
Sounds good to me. And then a question here from Mary. She asks, how were the cave paintings done? And she also says she thinks that the slide did say a stencil, but can't remember, unfortunately.
Yeah, so the stencils are one of the characteristic forms of art among forms of Aboriginal Australian art. And basically what happened was that the artist would put his or her hand up against the wall of a cave or an overhang, fill their mouth with a mixture of water and ochre and probably a little bit of spit, and very carefully spray it over the hand to create the stencil. They do the same thing with the boomerang. Other Aboriginal art probably used brushes. We know that in more recent times there were vines which you could cut and then chew the end of the vine, a very fibrous vine, and it would create a kind of paintbrush. So then use that paintbrush to draw the images on the walls. Of course, it must have been the case that there were many paintings done on bark, but those paintings, of course, haven't survived from before the period of European settlement, when that kind of material began to be collected and deliberately preserved.
Perfect, thank you, Robert. So, question here from Vicky, who is in the United States, and she asks, why is Captain Cook the most well-known explorer of Australia? What makes him so important?
So there's two things. One is that he was a great navigator. He was one of the best of the captains that the British Navy had at the time, and the British Navy was the world's best navy at the time. He was the man that they went to when they wanted to launch a long and difficult expedition. They sent him on 3 major expeditions into the Pacific. The first one that reached Australia, and the other 2 that went into other parts of the Pacific. And on the last expedition, he was killed while in Hawaii. He is known particularly for taking care of his crew. One of the striking things about that first expedition to Australia was that he didn't lose a single man from disease in that long journey from Britain to Tahiti, to the coast of Australia, and all the way to Batavia, today's Jakarta in the Netherlands Indies, today's Indonesia. He didn't lose a single man from scurvy or from any other disease. So he really looked after his crew. It was a bit of a disaster once he got to Batavia. About a third of the crew died of malaria and dysentery. So that was a pretty sad story. But he was a superlative leader of scientific expeditions. But it also happens that it was his expedition that led to the British settlement in Australia, and so he was naturally regarded as the precursor to that settlement, whereas the earlier Dutch visitors didn't lead to any kind of settlement, and so they tended to be marginalised.
Perfect, thank you, Robert. And then I've got a question here from Brittany, who is in the United States. And she asks, is family history and genealogy a popular hobby in Australia? And do you know if many people are able to trace their own ancestry back to the early colonial times?
It's extremely popular in Australia. And I think it's partly because for every Australian family, except for people of Aboriginal origin, there is a moment of arrival. There is a story of the circumstances that brought their ancestors to Australia. In some cases, it's romantic. In some cases, it's a bit pathetic. One of my distant relatives decided to come to Australia to visit her relatives. She was intending to go back to Britain, and she was so miserably seasick on the way out that she decided she couldn't bear to go home. So most Australians have a story of the circumstances that brought their ancestors to Australia, and these days, of course, it's so easy using some of the commercial sites to discover just when your ancestors arrived and where they came from. I suppose the other thing that is noticeable is that, particularly for people whose ancestors arrived in the 19th century, they tend to have ancestors from many different parts of Britain or different parts of Europe, and so there's many different interesting strands to trace. Whereas if you are in Britain, you might grow up in a city, city or town or a village or part of the countryside. You know that your ancestors have been there since time immemorial, since the Dreamtime, but they don't come from other places. So my ancestors come from Cornwall, from Devon, from Lincoln, from Durham, from Northumberland, from Jedburgh, from Northern Ireland, from Dumfries, and from Aberdeen. That gives me a lot of opportunities for some interest, and from the Isle of Man. So that gives me some pretty interesting opportunities for family history research, and a lot of Australians do that.
Yeah, it certainly does sound a lot more interesting than my family history. And then I've got a question here from Lonnie, and she's from the United States, and she asks, what was the first commercially viable industry to develop in Australia?
Well, in fact, the first commercially viable industry was the export of those sea cucumbers, the trepang. That was the first significant volume of exports from Australia. In the very early times, if there had been a good crop, there was a little bit of export of wheat. There was a little bit of export of timber, but it was wool that really became the first major and important export from Australia, and the wool industry transformed the economy of the colony.
Perfect, thank you, Robert. And then Eugene asks, what was the Castle Hill Rebellion?
Okay, so that's a little bit after the period that I was talking about. So during the gold rushes, very large numbers of people came to Australia, particularly to what became Victoria. They landed in Port Phillip, which is now Melbourne, and moved into the gold fields, which are 100 miles or so inland, and they were regarded by the authorities as troublesome and dangerous. And the authorities tried to charge them very high fees for the right to mine, for a license to mine. And they would go around and inspect the diggings for to make sure that the miners all had their licenses. If they didn't, they'd be hauled off and sent to jail. And of course, amongst the miners, there were some who did very well, some who found a lot of gold, others who didn't do so well. And the license was very expensive. So there were many who were trying to evade the license. And out of that situation, there grew a sense of civil disobedience amongst the miners, which led to a number of relatively low-scale mutinies or rebellions amongst the gold miners, and Castle Hill was one of those.
Perfect, thank you, Robert. And then Lottia from the United States asks, when the Aboriginal Tasmanians were isolated from the mainland, how did their lifestyles change?
So that's a very interesting question. So, the sea levels around Australia were much lower around about 18,000 years ago. That was during the last ice age, when large amounts of water were sucked up into the ice caps. And since then, or after that, the ice began to melt, the water rose, and Tasmania was isolated from the rest of the Australian continent. It seems likely that there were around about 5,000 Aboriginal Australians on Tasmania at the time, and that's a relatively small community. And it's a vulnerable community, particularly in an environment where the climate is not to be relied upon. Australia's climate is very different from most of the rest of the world, where the rest of the world tends to be used to a regular change of seasons. Of course, we do also have seasons. Australia's climate moves in much longer cycles of a decade or more. We tend to have 8 or 10 years of very dry weather, followed by a couple of years of very wet weather. We happen to be in a period of very wet weather at the moment. But in those long periods of dry weather, which can sometimes stretch out more than 10 years, of course, it's very difficult in the countryside. The animals find it very difficult, and if the animals are finding it difficult, the humans who hunt the animals are difficult. So Tasmania, the Tasmanian Aboriginal community, was very vulnerable to that kind of fluctuation in environment, and as a result, there seem to have been a number of catastrophic events in which the community lost knowledge. So most particularly, they lost the knowledge of how to make fire. So Aboriginal Australians on the mainland they rub sticks together with dry tinder, and they can make fire. But Aboriginal Tasmanians didn't do that. They had to capture fire from lightning strikes and so forth, and then they would keep the fire alight using burning coals. They didn't have returning boomerangs in the way that Aboriginal people on the mainland had. So when Europeans arrived in Australia, they looked at Aboriginal Australians and they thought, this is a community that is it's very different from our community, but they could see lots of evidence of Australian Aboriginal culture, of technologies that fitted the landscape. But when they came to Tasmania, Tasmanian Aboriginal people appeared to be at the very bottom of a kind of civilizational hierarchy. And that was above all, I mean, it was partly, of course, European prejudices, but it was above all because it was such a small community that had lost some of the knowledge that they once had.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Robert. So a next question from Mario, who is in the UK. He just simply asks, what food did the early Aborigines hunt and gather?
Okay, so they hunted anything that moved. So kangaroos. One of the great technologies of Aboriginal society was a tool called the woomera, which is a spear thrower. If any of you have tried throwing a spear, and I've only ever done this as a child, you know that grasping a spear and throwing it accurately is quite difficult. But this tool called a woomera is something which enabled Aboriginal Australians to throw the spear with greater force and greater accuracy. So they hunted kangaroos, they hunted emus, they hunted possums. We have possums in Australia. They're much nicer than North American possums, I have to say. And then they would also eat wild fruit. They would also dig up roots and tubers and so forth. It happens that my parents are botanists, and they did quite a lot of research when I was a child on edible native plants, and they would try them out on their children. So clearly we survived. We were poisoned twice because some of the procedures that were necessary to remove poisons from these food crops, or not crops, from these food items were quite complicated. Some things needed to be baked and then washed and then baked again, or buried in the ground for several months and then dug up and eaten. Some of it tasted pretty good. Some of it tasted really pretty awful.
My cooking. And then Alberto from the United States asks, how long did the Great Migration take from Africa to Australia?
So we think that it took around 10,000 years. So this is an area where there's a lot of research being done, and where the evidence is fragmentary, and so different archaeologists sometimes come up with different conclusions. The standard view is that modern humans began to move out of Africa around 60,000 years ago. They crossed into the Middle East, then moved around into India, and they spent some time in the south of India before moving on. Later on, some of them moved into Europe, some of them moved into East Asia. Eventually, they moved across around the Bering Strait into the Americas, but they moved from South India into Australia around about 10,000 years after they had left Africa. I've read some recent research that suggests that there may have been earlier migrations from Africa. So it's a constantly evolving area of research, but for the moment it looks as though it was a gradual movement over about 10,000 years.
Thank you, Robert. And then a question here from Rick. He says he really enjoys Australian wine. But when were the first vineyards planted in Australia?
Oh, that's a really good question, and I don't have a good answer to it. My guess is that the first vineyards were in the second half of the 19th century, as a consequence of the gold rush migrations. So people came to Australia in the middle of the 19th century from all over the world, not just they came from America, they came from Britain, they came from continental Europe, they came from Italy and from Germany, and many of them decided to settle in Australia. Some of the Italians and Germans turned their hands to agriculture, and they turned their hands to growing wine. But wine was not particularly important in Australian culture or Australian life until my lifetime. I was looking the other day at a magazine from the 1970s, which had a full-page advertisement assuring people in Australia there is a wine for every meal. Before that time, it was very rare for Australians, particularly Australians of British descent, to drink wine, but that has transformed completely, and now there are vineyards in every part of the country except the tropical north, and wine has become one of our important exports.
It certainly has. And then Mary from the US asks, can you please tell us about the edible underground caterpillars that are delicacies to the Aborigines?
These are called witchetty grubs. So they're not exactly underground. They're the grubs of a big moth that lays its eggs in dead trees, and the witchetty grubs grow inside the tree. They eat the wood, and they've got special bacteria and enzymes in the gut that dissolve the wood. And they grow to be, I'm not sure whether you can see, they grow to, well, how? They can grow to be about this long, so you get a good mouthful out of one of them. I've only ever had one in my life, and it was fried up in butter, and I have to say it tasted pretty good. Yeah, but they're not particularly common these days. You can't buy them in the shops or anything like that.
Perfect, thank you, Robert. And then a question here from David, who is in the US. He asks, what is it about the circumstances in Australia that there was no equivalent to the American Revolution against Great Britain?
Okay, so that's a really interesting question. Part of the answer is that Australia started later. So America had its revolution before European settlement even started in Australia, and the American Revolution, which was then followed by the French Revolution, was a transforming event in global history, because those two revolutions put onto the political agenda the idea of democracy, the idea of constitutional government. And even in Britain, which didn't have a written constitution and didn't have a revolution, the ideas of democracy were very, very much stronger in the 19th century than they were in the 18th century. So by the time the Australian colonies were large enough to think of some kind of imagining some kind of political independence or some kind of local autonomy, the British authorities were much more willing to consider transferring powers to their to those local authorities. They didn't see it as dangerous. They didn't see it as losing influence. They saw it much more as creating an allied society in another part of the world. So the mutinies amongst, or the rebellions amongst the gold miners, were the closest equivalent that we have to a kind of revolution. They were never really calling for independence. They were never calling for independence, but they were calling for some kind of major social revolution. And they produced a flag called the Eureka flag. The core of the revolution was a place called Eureka, just outside Ballarat in Victoria, and that flag is still used today as a flag of the revolutionary left and the revolutionary right in Australia. But nonetheless, we didn't have a revolution, basically because we didn't need one.
Perfect, thank you. And then Angela from the United States, she asks, are the merino sheep indigenous to Australia or an import?
They're an import. So there are, apart from rats, bats, and human beings and the dingo, there were no non-marsupial mammals that were indigenous to Australia. So the merino sheep came originally from Spain. And the Spanish climate has a certain amount in common with the Australian climate. Many of you will know that sometimes if filmmakers can't afford to come all the way to Australia, they'll use Spain as the substitute location for to pretend that they're filming in Australia. So the merinos came from Spain. They went to South Africa, which has a climate also similar to that of Australia, and then they were brought from South Africa or across the Indian Ocean to Australia.
Perfect, thank you, Robert. And then we've just got one last, it's not a question, funny enough, it's actually just a comment, but one last one from Poonam, who is located in the United States. And they say that the presentation that we've just gone through relates to the current book that they are reading called Nathaniel Nutmeg's Brutal Colonial History. And they say, thank you for such a captivating presentation.
Oh, that's right. Nathaniel's Nutmeg is a great book. It focuses much more on Indonesia than on Australia, but that was an era in which there was already starting to be some connection. And indeed, Nathaniel's Nutmeg is a great book, a great read. So thank you very much.
Right. Oh, we've had another comment coming actually whilst that whilst we were reading that one. It's from Robert and Maxine, and they say that they wish that you were on board their cruise when they went to Australia and New Zealand a few years ago. They love the way that you speak about Aboriginal history.
Oh, thank you very much.
And that's all we've got time for.
Well, thank you all for coming, and it's been a great pleasure to talk about Australian history. I hope that I see you on board one of our Viking cruises before too long.